Hey guys, Yips here, coming up with another video, and this is going to be the final build update for the ED Contagion Occultist. This build is absolutely incredible. It can do the leak mechanic. I've done Awakener 8, Maven, Formed, Elder Shaper, everything that you could possibly want to do on a leak start. This build is more than capable of doing, and doing it deathless. It's a crazy tank, it's swift at mapping, it's relatively easy to gear, and I'll probably be leak starting it again as long as no substantial changes happen in the future. In this video, what I really want to cover is the weaknesses of this build and things that you can do to combat it if you're playing a hardcore type character, and I'll talk a little bit about how to progress the character even beyond what I currently have found on SSF. So, the things that this build struggles with are degens like poisons, bleeds, and ignites, and the way that you manage them, at least currently without getting ailment immune, is just switch your flasks depending on the map. So if you roll a poison map, don't be lazy, put an immune poison flask on. I always have one because my build is slightly susceptible to chaos damage in terms of my energy shield doesn't protect against it, so a poison degen can be very, very threatening against my life pool. Chaos damage, not so much, because there's not enough sources of chaos damage to really hurt me at 75% chaos res, but poison immune is going to help me greatly against any sort of strong poison degen. I have a corrupting blood immune flask to help me against bleeds, and if I was to run a map where I know it has monsters can ignite, or if it has extra fire damage, or if I'm fighting against a boss that I know does really big ignites that are avoidable, but if I get hit I want to have some sort of backup, I'll put on an ignite immune flask. And that's how you really want to deal with those particular struggling types of degens. On bosses, it's not really a problem, but in terms of just your generic mapping, you want to be aware of those things and making sure that you have the correct flasks on to combat those particular weaknesses. The other sort of thing that this build isn't particularly strong against is monsters deal extra damage as fire, as cold, as whatever it might be, because your armor really isn't protecting you against that. Your armor does a great job in protecting you against physical damage. I've tanked Chimera, the boss that does a ton of physical damage, or Minotaur, without moving or pressing any ability. My health doesn't move. But when these monsters have deal extra damage as cold, extra damage as fire, you're not as protected against those particular things. Yes, you can do maps with those modifiers on them, and you are tanky enough to go into them and be totally fine, but if you're playing hardcore and you really want to combat those and deal with them a little bit more effectively, just put on resist flasks that reduce your damage taken by those particular modifier types, and that's where this build will really start to shine. The reason other hardcore builds might be more apt to dealing with those affixes, because if you have similar defenses in armor, but you also have evasion, then you're actually evading a lot of those hits that do that extra damage as, and that's a way of mitigating that type of damage, where this build doesn't really have a crazy amount of attack block. It's just sort of built to tank those physical hits. Spells aren't really going to affect you too much. I've built to 73% spell block, and I'd like to get a little bit more, but in terms of attacks, you don't really have any way of avoiding them, which is how a lot of players deal with those extra damage as modifiers. So if you are fighting, going into a map that has a lot of these type of things on them, just put an elemental flask that reduces your damage taken to them, and if you have the prefix gain charges when you're hit by an enemy, since you get hit all the time, these flasks are going to be permanently up. This Quicksilver flask, or this Silver flask that I have that gives me Onslaught, it has 6 charges when you're hit. It is always up through the entire map that I'm doing. It's never down, it's super good. This modifier, the gain charges on hit, is the best flask modifier in the game. I promise you, it is extremely good as the prefix. So those are ways that you can deal with some of the weaknesses with this build. Otherwise, everything else is amazing. You're super tanky against everything in the game. Against bosses, you can pick up a little bit more spell block. Things like Maven, Awakener, Shaper, 75 spell block is something you could look to get if you're not comfortable at dodging the mechanics, but I was totally fine running 55% spell block on those bosses. I had enough regen, I had enough sustain to where they couldn't really kill me, but if you want a little bit more, the option is there for you to get. So this build, very, very good. The last thing I want to talk about is a little bit of the gearing updates that you could make if you're playing on softcore or you're looking to progress further on hardcore. Getting a multi-modded pair of gloves with +1 to projectile gems will increase the damage of your clear, so your essence drain would go from level 21 to 24 instead of 21 to 23. So that's what I currently have as level 23 ED, but you could get 24 if you're able to get +2 on your gloves. Getting a better hunter amulet with dot multi on it really hard to roll, but if you go into Harvest and you're spamming those Chaos rerolls on a Hunter Amulet, eventually you'll get +1 to Chaos or +1 to Intelligence with dot multi on it. That's really what you're going for, so if you can roll for that, I highly recommend getting it. If you're looking to buy it on softcore, it will be a little bit of an expensive purchase, but I guarantee you it will be worth it. Last upgrade that I'm looking to really make for my character is changing to a shield or a chest piece with +1 to level of socketed active skill gems. This is going to raise your blight from level 20 base to level 21, and then obviously you get increased levels from other places. That's just going to give you flat 10% more damage, and this chest that I have on it has resistances on it, and that will allow me to get more attributes and more damage modifiers on my other pieces of gear. So just some really chase items that you could be going for with this particular build, and overall, like I said, very happy with this build. It's an absolute monster for tank. It does clear, it can do absolutely everything. And just to showcase a little bit of this build, I'm going to jump into this harvest and show you some of the tankiness that this build really can do against mobs that are relatively dangerous. Harvest can be a pretty scary thing, but this build does it pretty flawlessly. So let's go ahead and get into this harvest. And what I do before I go into harvest is I pre-channel my blight, and this gives me my infusion as well as my arcane surge. So pre-channel my blight. When the harvest pops, hit my flask, contagion, essence drain, withering step, and you can see the chaos damage is hurting me. That's what's reducing my life there, and that's why I do have that poison flask on. But you can see my energy shield basically never moved because of that ES on block, and overall extremely tanky even against a T15 harvest with all of these mods on. Let's go see if we can find another one here. So something like this. So pre-channel my blight, put my flasks up, contagion, essence drain, withering step, hit my vol blight, everything is going to melt. And no problem. Okay, some more. There should be one more harvest down here. Let's quickly pop it off. Standing and everything, no problem. Get my vol blight out. And they usually the absolute tank of the build. So no problem just sitting there tanking these harvests. Yes, some harvests will be more aggressive and do more damage to you than other types, but overall, this wasn't too bad. You can see I'm at corruption level 71 on this map, and it's been no problem. You can go even further with this build. It's excellent at doing the Scourge mechanic. So this build, absolute tank, does extremely well overall in the League mechanic. Any sort of boss that you want to do, you should have no problems with. The only thing I will say with this build is it's probably not going to be able to do some of the harder aspirational content. You'll probably need more damage, but for tank, this build is an absolute monster. So thanks for watching. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this build as a league start, and I'll look towards other builds in the future that I can make. So peace.